Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, long-term viewers and listeners to the show know that we've spent an awful lot of time thinking about a divided America on Keen on America. We've covered organizations like Braver Angels, who are focused on bringing Americans back together. And we've covered the work of people like my friend, Arlie Russell Hochschild, a brilliant sociologist from University of California at Berkeley, who has authored two incredibly important books about a divided America. Excuse me. The first is Strangers in Their Own Lands, which really defined or began the genre. And then her new book, Stolen Pride, Lost Shame and the Rise of the Right. What Arlie does is bring her own academic skills as a sociologist to making sense and fixing some of the divisions in America. And our guest today, I think, can be thought of in the same category as Arlie. Anand Pandian is a professor of anthropology at Johns Hopkins University, and is the author of a new book about a divided America, Something Between Us, the Everyday Walls of American Life and How to Take Them Down, which in some ways brings his own tools of anthropology to make sense of America today, contemporary America. Anand Pandian is joining us from Baltimore, Maryland, where Johns Hopkins is based. Anand, welcome. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It really is a pleasure to join you to talk about the book today.
So I've been very generous and kind, Anand, about you in the sense that I'm talking about you in the same breath as Arlie Russell Hochschild, which is quite fine company for you. Is it fair to compare your kind of work with Arlie's in the sense that you're bringing your skills as an anthropologist to make sense of a divided contemporary America?
Well, it isn't really fair, to be honest, because Arlie Hochschild is a legend, and she's someone that folks like me, folks of my generation, have had to learn a great deal from when it comes to the practice of ethnography, when it comes to these questions of social and political divides, when it comes to the basic challenge that so many of us have these days of figuring out how to have conversations with people whose views of the world, whose takes on the world are so much different than ours, and how to find anything meaningful, honestly, to say to each other. I've learned a great deal from her work, from both of those books that you mentioned, and I definitely am privileged to be considered as working in that same vein, in making sense of these political conundrums here in the United States.
But coming back to your work as an anthropologist, you wrote a book called, back in 2019, A Possible Anthropology, Methods for Uneasy Times. Our times are perhaps in 2025, 6 years later, even uneasier. Do you bring particular skills to this book? I mean, in some ways, it's a narrative of your travels in America, but what kind of skills as an anthropologist do you bring that non-academic writers can learn from?
Well, one thing that my field of anthropology shares with the work of many people who work in Arlie Hochschild's field of sociology is a commitment to ethnography as a method. Ethnographic research is based on the idea that the best way of understanding the life of people in a particular social, cultural, historical situation is to immerse oneself in the day-to-day circumstances of those people as much as possible, to imagine what it's like to live in those environments, to live in the company of others around them, to do what those people do, and to try to see what the world would look like from that concrete point of view, which requires those of us who do this kind of work to travel, to commit to being in other places, distant from our own, often very distant in the case of anthropology, because so many anthropologists, as you probably know, work in parts of the world that are very far from where we are, you and I today in the United States. But it also requires a different kind of commitment, a commitment to listen, a commitment to learn in conversation, a commitment to find oneself in situations of strangeness, of discomfort, often of existential unease, and to meet those circumstances with an open mind, to meet people with an open mind, and again, to try to see the world from their standpoint, setting aside what assumptions and prejudices we might have ourselves as scholars, individuals, and so on.
What's the difference, Anand, and I excuse the naivety of this question. What's the difference between being an anthropologist and being a sociologist? They sound to me like they're doing the same kind of thing.
It's really wonderful that you asked that question. It's something that we certainly wrestle with and think a lot about these days in fields like ours. I would say classically, sociologists were concerned with industrial modernity in the West. They were concerned with the radical transformations that the Industrial Revolution and other forms of social change brought to the ways in which people in Europe and the United States and so on lived, the radical transformation in these societies that these changes wrought. Anthropologists classically have worked beyond the West in other places. And in fact, to be honest, anthropology began as a field in the shadow of Western colonialism and imperialism. It began as an effort to understand, and perhaps not just understand, but also manage and intervene differently with regard to the lives of people who were under the thumb of Western dominating powers. And in more recent years, anthropology has become quite critical of that colonial history on the one hand, but also taken seriously the kind of challenge that sociologists have been wrestling with as well, which is what does it mean to live in societies like ours in circumstances such as we have them in places like the United States now. And so in that sense, I would say the distinction between anthropology and sociology has really blurred to a great degree in recent years. What we share, once again, is this common commitment to ethnographic method, to ethnographic exposure, immersion, deep listening, conversation, exposure as a way of making sense of how people live and what they're after from the inside out.
Subtitle of your book is The Everyday Walls of American Life and How to Take Them Down. Sounds like the walls of American academic life, certainly the walls between anthropology and sociology, have been taken down. So you're all doing the same kind of thing in a way. I guess traditional anthropologists looked at the so-called developing world, and now parts of America are no different, certainly no wealthier or more successful than, quote unquote, the developing world, in many ways less developed. The walls between anthropology and sociology are naturally broken down. And tell me a little bit about yourself. Let's reverse the lens. You study the world. Let's study Anand Pandian. Where did you come from?
Well, I am the child of immigrants to the United States. My parents came to the United States in the 1970s. My father is a physician, a cardiologist, and he, like many others, came as doctors to the United States in the early 1970s when there was a real shortage of medical expertise in this country. And
where did he come from?
From South India, from the South Indian state of Tamil Nadu. And he grew up in a city called Madurai, where we still have a lot of family and we think of as our native place. And we were able to make a living here. right? Our family and many others who came along with my parents at that time, from the same region, sometimes from the same medical school class, and we I inherit that immigrant legacy.
Where were you? You were born then in the U.S.
I was born in the US. I was born in New York City, in the Bronx, actually. My sister and I were both born in New York. We eventually moved to Los Angeles, where my brother was born.
Do you think, talking to you perhaps as a teenager or even a graduate student, I know you were at UC Berkeley in the 90s, could you have ever imagined treating America as an anthropological subject? Did it occur to you, I mean, even before you were a grad student and probably didn't even know what the word anthropology meant, but did you think, and your family think, of America as being an advanced place, the quintessentially modern community in the world, your family coming from South India? Presumably they were economic migrants, people who wanted the opportunity, the money, the lifestyle in the United States.
But also the chance to educate their children, the chance to give them the kind of life that they couldn't have themselves. My family, my father's family in particular, was quite poor. My grandfather, my father's father, was orphaned at a very young age. He was a shop boy for many years. I've written another book together with my grandfather about the really improbable trajectory of his life. He grew up in Burma. He came back to India at the outbreak of the Second World War as a refugee. He was really left penniless when he came back.
Aya's
Aya's accounts, exactly.
Yeah, this was your book written in 2014.
Exactly, and we used the near century of my grandfather's life as a way of telling a story in that book about modern India and the radical changes that you've seen in that country over the last century. But I share all this because the immigrant experience is, of course, about opportunity, but it is also about displacement. It's about learning to make your way in a world that isn't your own, learning to assimilate values and ideas and experiences that are unfamiliar to you. And I would say that at some level, there is no anthropology without a willingness to entertain that possibility. You can't do work like ours without a willingness to sort of abide with conditions of being somewhat out of place. And so, though I didn't necessarily think of becoming an anthropologist growing up, the basic challenge of navigating cultural situations and circumstances that were different from what we had at home or what we knew that our extended family would practice. All of those things were in fact familiar to me. I had one foot in this country growing up. I had another foot in India growing up, and I wound up being an anthropologist of India. Several of my books are based, like the one that you just mentioned, on field research I've done over the course of many years
and you just
in
wrote
India.
One on Hollywood, on the
filmmaking.
movie industry.
Exactly. And
sorry, go on.
Oh no! Well, what I was going to say is that I was pretty comfortable with that notion that as an anthropologist, my task was to bring back to the United States stories from elsewhere. But it really was the 2016 election cycle and the rise of this xenophobic rhetoric and all of these promises that were made about expelling people who didn't belong that got me really unsettled. It hit our family in personal ways as well. My own father was yelled at one day when he was walking down the road in Santa Monica, California, "Go back to your own country." I recount in the book an incident that my own son faced that fall of 2016 at the swimming pool where he was learning how to swim at the age of 8. All of these things hit us really personally.
What happened to your son? What was
well,
his
as I talk about in the conclusion of the book, my son and daughter were taking swimming lessons at the time at a pool called Meadowbrook, north of Baltimore, which is where we live. And this was a pool, like many others in past decades, that was segregated. Baltimore is the city that in some ways pioneered the practice of residential segregation in the United States, and so many facilities in the city, neighborhoods, all kinds of resources were developed in a highly segregated manner in racial terms. And though that history has been superseded in many ways, its legacy persists. And we were shocked to find one afternoon, that November of 2016, our child coming crying out of a locker room one Saturday afternoon and reporting that there were kids, teenagers, who had taunted him for the color of his skin, making jokes about how much better the pool had been when they hadn't allowed coloreds into the facility. And the racism was one thing. The recurrence of this word, coloreds, was the strangest thing. I never heard this word. Right? And it was so strange to have our child, who was born in this city, come out of this locker room and use this word in the year 2016, coloreds, in the plural, right? And to try to make sense of that. And what we realized is that the pool, in celebrating its heritage, had almost unintentionally put that legacy of racial segregation forward, because all the photos that were up on the walls at that time were of the white people who were allowed there. There's actually a photo that you can find online of a time when the facility had the word Gentiles only, a sign with those words posted out front, because it was no blacks, no Jews, right? And so that history, which was in a way marked and even celebrated by all the signage on the walls during that context of racist vitriol in the fall of 2016, became, I would say, a kind of a bit of a goad to this racist jibe that our own child faced. And so for reasons like this, I decided that I had to turn my anthropological lens on this country where I was born and raised, and to try to make sense of it all over again.
The book's title, Something Between Us, of course, borrows the language of the great African-American writer James Baldwin. We're doing a show. There's a new biography of Baldwin coming out in the fall. I'm looking forward to that show. I think it'll be exceptional. Has anything changed then? I'm sure this is a question that you've asked yourself many times, both in and out of the new book and in your writing. Has anything changed since Baldwin?
Yeah, it's a great question. As I talk about in the book, the phrase "something between us" comes from the famous debate that he had with William F. Buckley at Cambridge University, where at a certain point, Baldwin is recounting what it's like to be Black outside the United States, and in Europe in particular, and the sort of disdain and indifference with which white Americans meet him when they're outside the United States. And yet, Baldwin says, there is something between us. They are my compatriots, whether or not they like that idea. And the book plays on that double sense of something between us, that on the one hand, there's that connection that Baldwin insists on, that national connection, the connection of a common shared frame. But on the other hand, there's clearly a barrier. There's clearly something standing in the way of the recognition of that commonality. Baldwin was prescient in all kinds of ways with regard to these dynamics. And there's an enormous amount, I think, that we can still learn from his thinking and from his work, even on this very question of walls and the way in which they work to isolate and insulate those on the inside from having to care about those on the outside. He writes in other places about the indifference that that kind of spatial segregation can allow for, can sustain with regard to the well-being of those beyond our walls. So I'm definitely thinking with him and relying on him as a co-traveler in this investigation, along with many others. But certainly, things have become more intense, more difficult, well nigh impossible in all kinds of ways. And many people that I spoke to, even for this book, talked to me quite candidly about their sense that the country itself was on the verge of a kind of civil war. So this is part of what I'm trying to make sense of. How did things get the way they did?
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned the Baldwin-Buckley debate. We've got an upcoming show with Sam Tannenhouse, who has a new biography of of William Buckley out, so I'll have to ask him about the Baldwin debate. Your book, though, is an attempt to not only to make sense of what's happening, but also to bring the walls down. I mean, it's clear where your politics are, Anand. You're not shy to express that. It's clear that you're for a multicultural, tolerant, understanding America. But you don't seem as angry as some other writers. Recently, we had Deborah Baker on the show. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her. She lives in Charlottesville, Virginia. She has a new book out, Charlottesville, An American Story, which is about the Unite the Right rally in 2017, where people walked around her town, great university town, Jefferson's town, waving Nazi flags and chanting Nazi songs about Jews and blacks. Are you trying to do away with the walls between the Unite the Right folks and guys like yourself and probably myself? Or are you trying to shift the walls? What are your politics here? Are you angry? I mean, you clearly, as a parent, and who wouldn't be, you'd be furious and completely upset if your 9-year-old child was subjected to the kind of overt racism that he experienced in that Baltimore swimming pool. But
absolutely.
You still are. I mean, there's still the politics of hopefulness here, right?
So I think a lot turns on where we seek or how we seek those resources for hope. And I think there's a lot at stake in how we understand the impasses that we've arrived at and the kinds of paths that we might imagine as ways of moving forward, or at least moving around them. The situation with regard to Charlottesville is one that, of course, I'm really familiar with. And as you probably know, one of the chapters in my book actually focuses on the first major white nationalist rally that took place after Charlottesville. It was a rally that took place.
Lives Matter rally in Shelbyville. And actually, as it happens, in Arlie's new book, Stolen Pride, I'm not sure if you've had a look at it, the narrative is driven by one of those rallies that didn't actually turn out to happen in Kentucky as well.
That's right. I have read the book, and I am familiar with that story that she tells. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that there are things happening now in this country that are profoundly violent, profoundly dangerous, and that we need to find a way of containing, and we need to find a way of managing in a different way that doesn't result in the continuing deepening of the kind of hatred and vitriol that we've seen so much, especially in online venues. And in going to a rally like that, as I did and as I recount in this book, the effort is not to somehow seek common ground or to find agreement, to sort of find a place of compromise between.
So you're not, I'm not sure how familiar you are with Braver Angels, but you're not really in that camp.
Well, it's not that I'm not in that camp. The question is, what are we doing where? I think that there are definitely occasions in which conversation is absolutely necessary, occasions in which a different kind of mutual understanding is both possible and necessary. I have really interesting conversations throughout this book with people on the conservative side of the political spectrum who surprise me in all kinds of ways, who find that I surprise them in all kinds of ways. One of the central characters in the book, in another chapter based in Fargo, North Dakota, is a real estate agent who came to my interest. We met at a builders conference in Florida in early 2017. And he struck me as really interesting because on the one hand, he was absolutely clear that he was a Republican and he was a deep supporter of the party, at least at that time. But on the other hand, he had deep personal commitments to soil and water conservation. And there were things that he was doing in his life that were clearly more complicated than a caricature one might have of a diehard Republican from North Dakota. And indeed, when I spent some time with him in Fargo later that year, I became aware of some of those complexities, the nuances in his positions with regard to immigrants and refugees, for example. And this is a little of what I talk about in that chapter. There's another chapter where I talk about an old friend of mine that I grew up with in Southern California, who grew up leaning conservative, who grew up listening to right-wing talk radio, and how we just stopped talking after a certain point, but began talking once again in 2017, and try to make sense really of how it was that the two of us had fallen into this circumstance of mutual unintelligibility, where we couldn't make sense of each other, of what each other cared about, or even how each other understood what was even happening in the world. I mentioned both of those two figures, and I'll come back to the white nationalists in a second. I mentioned both of those two figures because they're people, there's some among the several people that I encountered through this research who ultimately shifted their own political allegiances, who came to a different understanding of their own political coordinates and a different sense of what their existing party identities could actually enable. That is happening in this country. There are a lot of people who are questioning long-standing commitments that they've made, that their communities have made, that their families have made. They're searching. They feel that they're politically homeless. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that and we find a way of meeting that in a more open spirit. That doesn't mean, and that is, sorry, just to kind of step back to what you mentioned a second ago, I think that's the kind of work that organizations like Braver Angels are interested in facilitating. That doesn't mean that you can do that everywhere and with everyone. And that's certainly not what I was trying to do in the context of that white nationalist rally.
Right. So let's go back to the white nationalists,
exactly.
the White Lives Matter event in October 2017 in Tennessee that you write about in the book. As I said, Deborah Baker writes about the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and Arlie also writes about that kind of rally, but she writes a little more sympathetically. She tries to make sense of some of the characters who were potentially going to be involved in the rally in Kentucky, which didn't actually turn out to happen. What's your take on the kind of characters who showed up for the White Lives Matter rally? Are they men and stuck in their basements without work? Have they been humiliated by our increasingly feminized culture? Are they psychopaths? Are they Nazis? What do you make of them, and why are we seeing more and more of them in the 2020s in America?
They were mostly men. And these larger concerns around the rise of a kind of misogynistic culture and the hard lines of concern and unconcern that it's founded on are really serious matters. There's a gender politics to the intolerance that we see so much of in this country that we have to take seriously. And I try to take seriously as well in different ways, in different contexts in this book. Getting back to that rally in particular, one thing that I noticed and that I write about in that chapter, you're showing a glimpse of the short piece that was in The Guardian that gives a little snapshot of that section, but there's a lot more to say in that chapter from the book itself. One of the things that I point out is that there was a certain kind of tension, or a certain kind of let's just call it a tension, or at least a difference between those who were there in jackboots, in uniforms, in with the plastic shields and other fascist regalia. Those who were clearly part of organized formations of a fascist nature. There's a difference between those folks, a stark visual difference, let's say, and others, the many others, again, mostly men, who are on the sidelines, but still expressed a sense of sympathy for this politics, an interest in this politics, an interest in the idea some support for the idea of breaking the United States up into a series of ethno-states, which was the manifest mission of the organizers of this particular event. I spent a lot of time that day in Shelbyville speaking to people like that, to men like that, who are on the periphery of that demonstration. What I really wanted to make sense of is what they were doing there. What is it that drew them to this kind of politics? There's a somewhat humorous, but also in a way slightly disturbing interaction with a man from the Bronx. I was born as well, that I recount in the book. I told him about how we'd come to this country as a family, and I just asked him point blank, what would you do with people like me, right? People who are invited to come here because the services of people like my father were needed. And he sort of joked, well, you're from India, you guys are Aryan, right? And I don't know. I mean, was that a way to connect? Was it just a joke? The thing for me is that I think it's really important to try to figure out how it is that radical positions, sometimes even monstrous positions, can grow out of really everyday, banal circumstances, right? Things that you don't necessarily take that seriously can wind up having really terrible, difficult effects. And that gentleman in particular, I remember him making sense of this idea of the ethno-state by talking about how it is that when you're on an airplane, you're always advised to put your own mask on before you take care of anyone else. And he saw it in those terms. It was as though there were just these warrants in everyday life that taught us that we had to look out for ourselves before we looked out for anyone else. And if we felt that our own lives were in danger, we couldn't afford to look after anyone else. So I want to make sense of how it is that people come to imagine their relationship to others unlike them in such antagonistic terms, not to bridge the divide per se, but instead to understand how it got as deep as it does. And that's really the explanatory burden of the book, to try to make sense of why this antagonistic sense of one's own well-being as opposed to the well-being of others has such deep roots in the contemporary United States.
What about the counter narrative, Anand? I'm sure you heard it many times, probably from some of the white nationalists in Tennessee and elsewhere, that the American establishment now has become woke. The universities are controlled by people who are intolerant of other views, that conservatives in a generic sense, no longer have a voice. Is there any truth to that narrative in terms of what you call these everyday walls of America?
Look, I think this is something that all of us are potentially susceptible to. All of us are susceptible to the temptation of isolating ourselves in the company of others who are just like us, who share the same views, who have the same perspectives on the world, who have the same economic class, the same social background. All of us can do this. And those forms of self-isolation can have a lot of consequences for the kinds of interactions we're capable of having, the kinds of things we're incapable of doing, the extent to which we can meet others with other ideas in a spirit of tolerance and openness rather than a kind of knee-jerk dismissal. This is certainly something that we need to be careful about in our own spaces, in our own intellectual and cultural spaces as well. I write in the book about my ongoing conversations and interactions and in fact arguments with a man I call Frank, a small businessman from southern Michigan who I met at a libertarian festival in Las Vegas. I describe my visiting his town in southern Michigan, but I also talk in the book about how he visited me in Baltimore, how he spent an afternoon walking around my campus, how he was walking around really vexed about the idea that there were all kinds of ideas that simply had no place on a campus like mine, to which I had to disagree. And I had to point out, well, actually, there was this talk that happened, and there was that talk that happened. He was a big fan of free markets. And we walked into my office, and it just so happened that there was a copy of a book by Adam Smith sitting on my desk that day. It was Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I held it up just as a way, again, of showing that, those ideas have their place.
Well, but Adam Smith is not. I mean, it sounds to me that was a rather long-winded response to my question, suggesting that your side, your group really hasn't done anything wrong. The other side are the ones who don't get it. He shows up to your university, you show him around. He comes into your office, and there's a book from Adam Smith on the desk, which proves that somehow the idea of the free market is attractive. I mean, that doesn't sound very convincing to me.
Well, look. I was getting around to your question, and forgive me for being long-winded. I am an academic, and maybe we have that habit. But the point I'm trying to make is that I think the situation has been overblown. I think that there's a great deal of exaggeration with regard to what is said about the narrowness of our discourse and our conversations in academic spaces like mine. Having said that, though, I will acknowledge that there's a lot of work that we have to do as well. There's a reason why you and I are having this conversation right now. We're having this conversation because in writing this book, I chose to write it in a non-academic voice. I chose to write it as a storyteller. I chose to write it without jargon.
Although I chose to write it. I don't agree with that either. I mean, I'm guessing that 95% of our audience are pretty sympathetic to what you're arguing, to your politics, as I am. So I think we're probably as much in the echo chamber as everyone else. It's very hard to break out of. Let's deal with then how to take these walls down. We know what the walls are. You're not the first or the last person to observe them. You're looking at these walls as an anthropologist. How do we take them down? That's the subtitle of your book. What ways do we have, all Americans, to bring these walls down?
Well, getting back to what I was saying a second ago, I think it's really important to get out of the spaces that we've locked ourselves into. I think I take that commitment seriously as an anthropologist. This book grew out of a commitment I made some years ago to talk with people whose ideas are very different than my own, to reach out to people whose position in the world is very different from the position that I occupy in the United States, and to see what I could to try to understand this country from their point of view. I did that as an anthropologist, but I think that there are many other ways of doing this as well. A lot of what I'm interested in the book has to do with, in terms of that other side of things, in terms of taking these walls down, so to speak, has to do with forms of social, cultural, and political organizing that lean into what it is that people share with others. What it is that the forms of, say, common sense and common ground we can arrive at by organizing in the company of others, by agitating in public space for other pictures of what this country could be. I spend a great deal of time with activists, as you know, for racial justice, for environmental justice, for gender justice, people who are working to build coalitions of the kind that can produce meaningful social change under conditions of radical polarization, often requiring the formation of alliances and political openings that sit a little uncomfortably with our taken for granted political divides, right? There's a whole chapter in the book about the movements all around the country to abolish the pink tax, which have found a great deal of success in Republican states, often at the same time that restrictions on reproductive freedoms have been mounted. I'm interested in why that's possible.
Pink tax is? I don't know what that is.
Yeah, so the pink tax is the tax on menstrual products, and it's a measure that has been in place in many American states for some years now, and I talk in that chapter in particular about movements to abolish the pink tax around the United States, and I follow in particular a successful campaign to do so in the state of Ohio. And I focus on a certain kind of paradox that we might see. How do we make sense of the fact that in the same years that we saw the tightening of restrictions on reproductive rights in a state like Ohio, we saw the rollback of this particular measure, which advocates argued was discriminatory with regard to, to those who menstruate. And what I try to show is that that political opening grew out of some pretty unlikely coalitions that formed between people on the right and the left who found common ground in deciding to campaign against this particular imposition.
So in
but
a
I
sense,
also,
then your argument isn't that different from Braver Angels. It's ways in which conservatives and liberals, or right and left, can actually agree on stuff. The environment, perhaps, as you know, reproductive rights. Although some people might be watching this, Anna, and thinking, this guy doesn't really want to get rid of the walls. He just, like so many in his camp, they just want to make everyone like us, accept our language, accept our world, essentially extend their wall to incorporate all of society. I know that maybe sound slightly unfair, but it always seems as if ultimately these kinds of books suggest that we can convince other people who are somehow different from us to agree with our views, and it's our views that win out in the end.
The book though is as much an account of why it is that agreement is difficult as it is, and even impossible as it is, an attempt to arrive at other forms of agreement. I mean, there's a reason why it's called Something Between Us. There's a reason why the subtitle begins by
so is the
naming
subtitle in a sense,
walls.
and then that's what I'm curious about. So you've got this Baldwin-esque title, Something Between Us. The subtitle seems softer, The Everyday Walls of American Life and How to Take Them Down. But did James Baldwin believe these walls could be taken down? And do you? Are you suggesting that really you don't believe the walls can be gotten rid of?
I think it's a difficult thing to do. And I think that there are many circumstances in this country that leave me, as many others, with a great deal of unease and sometimes even despair. I talk about circumstances that are really difficult. I talk about the fact that a fifth of all Americans who live in residential communities now live in communities that are gated. I talk about what the 80% market share that SUVs and light trucks now enjoy in the American automotive market represents with regard to the zenith of certain ideas of protecting oneself at any cost on the roads. I talk about the toxicity that social media and what I call the walls of the mind have made possible, and the deep gulfs of misunderstanding that we've fallen into. All of these things are real. And part of the effort here is to simply ask us to acknowledge the reality of these divisions and to pay attention to what can happen when they stack on top of each other. What the impasses we arrive at when you leave your when you leave your house, not through your front door, but with your car, through the garage, in a sealed vehicle that departs from another sealed space, and travel alone in that vehicle to wherever you're going, say for work or whatever, but you're doing it and you're listening perhaps to to some kind of media, if it's political commentary that again may be really polarizing and presumes that that you're in full agreement or great agreement with what's being shared. And so you have these ways in which these divisions sort of layer on top of each other and magnify those differences. That's a lot of what I'm trying to make sense of. But the book is ultimately hopeful because I talk about circumstances of real change. I talk about circumstances of change here in Baltimore in the company of activists that I've known and have worked with for many years now. I talk about movements that I've encountered in Texas, in upstate New York, in Ohio, as I was mentioning, that have managed to do really important things. I think it's important to be able to hang on to a realistic sense of the difficulty we're in, while at the same time not allowing that sense of these difficulties to completely obscure from view our understanding of what remains possible.
Well, troubling, but perhaps ultimately optimistic. Anand Pandian's new book, Something Between Us. It's just out. Very interesting new book, and complements the work of people like Arlie Hochschild. Something Between Us: The Everyday Walls of American Life and How to Take Them Down. And I hope we are able to take them down. Maybe this show will help. Thank you so much, and congratulations on the new book.
Thank you for the chance to talk with you. I really appreciated it.